Hello everyone, welcome you all to a new movie explanation video. In this video, I will be explaining about the movie The SHAWSHANK Redemption. It is a movie directed by Frank Darabont, and this movie was released on September 22, 1994. A Maine banker named Andy Dufresne, Tim Robbins, is found guilty of killing his wife and her boyfriend, a professional golfer, in 1947. He receives 2 consecutive life sentences and is transferred to the notoriously harsh Shashank prison because Maine does not have a death penalty. Despite Andy's repeated denials of guilt, everyone believes he is the one who committed the crime due to his cold and cunning personality. After serving 20 years in Shashank for murder, Ellis Boyd Redding, Morgan Freeman, often known as Red, is currently being considered for release. Red's parole application is denied despite his best efforts and conduct, but this doesn't bother him much. Red is then shown to be the neighborhood smuggler who can obtain prisoners anything they want as long as it is reasonable. All convicts are informed of the coming of visitors via an alarm. Red and his buddies wager on which new fish will experience a panic attack on his first night in jail. Red makes a sizable wager on Andy. The first night, an obese newcomer known as Fat Ass loses it and starts crying uncontrollably, which helps Hewood, William Sadler, win the wager. The joy, however, is short-lived as Byron Hadley, the main guard, Clancy Brown, brutally beats the overweight guy for refusing to keep silent when he was requested to. Andy, meanwhile, keeps his composure and resolve. The convicts find out the next morning that Fat Ass passed away in the hospital because the jail doctor was out for the evening. Hewood refuses Andy's request to learn the man's name. A month or so later, Andy approaches Red since he's heard he's good at discovering stuff. He asks Red to help him obtain a rock hammer, which he believes is essential for his passion of collecting and carving rocks. Red queries Andy about his motives, but Andy laughs them off. Red agrees to provide the order and cautions Andy about the Sisters, a gang of inmates who commit sexual attacks on other inmates, particularly its leader Boggs, Mark Rolston, who has feelings for Andy. Red also agrees to give the order. Andy is viewed as a fairly chilly fish by the other inmates, but Red immediately takes a like to him. Red speculates that Andy is planning to use the hammer to create an escape in the future, but when he finally realizes the enormity of the object, he realizes why Andy laughed and joins in, dismissing the idea that Andy could ever use the instrument to dig his way out of jail. Andy spends the most of his time during the first 2 years of his imprisonment fending off Boggs and the Sisters or working in the prison laundry. Andy is frequently beaten and raped but doesn't speak out about it since he continually fights them off. Red uses his connections to get Andy and a couple of their common friends assigned to the work detail when it's announced that one of the prison buildings needs to have its roof tarred. This gives everyone a break from the routine. Andy hears Hadley lamenting at work about having to pay taxes on a future inheritance. Using his knowledge as a banker, Andy explains to Hadley how he may conceal his funds from the IRS by using them to make a one-time present for his wife. Then, while on the tarring job, he offers to help Hadley fill out the paperwork in return for some cool beers for his fellow prisoners. Before agreeing to provide the convicts, who are laboring cold beers before the task is completed, Hadley first threatens to toss Andy from the roof. Red says that although Andy may have contrived the privilege to win the respect of the guards, as well as his other prisoners, he also may have done it just to feel normal again. While watching a movie, Andy approaches Red and makes another odd request, Rita Hayworth. Red is taken aback by the request, but she decides to place the order. Andy runs into the Sisters once again as He leaves the theater. He manages to argue his way out of being raped, but after being viciously battered to within an inch of his life, he spends a month in the hospital. Due to the beating, Boggs is kept in isolation for a week. He discovers Hadley and his men waiting for him in his cell as he exits. He is taken to a prison hospital upstate after being beaten so severely that he would never again be able to walk or consume solid food. The sisters leave Andy alone and don't disturb him again. When Andy leaves the hospital, Red and his buddies have left him some pebbles to sculpt and a massive Rita Hayworth picture in his cell. After learning that Andy had assisted Hadley, Warden Samuel Norton, Bob Gunton, conducts an unexpected cell check to assist Andy. While the guards are turning the cell upside down looking for contraband, he discovers Andy reading his copy of the Bible, and they chat about their favorite verses. The warden leaves after their interaction, almost forgetting to return Andy's Bible. Then he tells Andy that salvation lies within and urges him to keep reading the Bible. Brooks Hatlin at the library, James Whitmore. The reason for his relocation becomes clear when a jail officer arrives and requests Andy's financial advice. Andy puts up a temporary workstation and gets to work, giving most jail guards financial advice and assisting them with their tax filings. Andy also sees a chance to increase the jail library, so he begins by requesting funding from the Maine State Senate. Every week he sends letters. Even guards from neighboring prisons seek out Andy's financial advice when they visit for interprison baseball games because they value his financial support practice so highly. Andy is also helping the warden with his tax filings. Soon later, Brooks loses it and declares that he will murder Haywood if he is not released on parole. Andy is able to reason with him. Red understands Brooks' seeming institutionalization after 50 years at SHAWSHANK when his pals talk about his conduct. He is unable to acclimate to the outside world since he has practically been trained to live as a prisoner for the rest of his life. Red comments, "These walls make me laugh. You initially despise them before coming to accept them. Once enough time has passed, you begin to rely on them." After being granted parole, Brooks moves into a halfway house. Additionally, he receives a job at a grocery, which he despises. He finally commits suicide after finding it unable to adjust to life outside of prison and leaves the note "Brooks was here" etched on a wooden beam. Andy receives $200 from the state for the library along with a selection of vintage books and recordings after 6 years of letter writing. The state senate believes that this will be sufficient to convince Andy to stop his letter writing campaign, but he is undeterred and increases his efforts. Andy discovers a copy of Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro among the donated old documents when they are delivered to the warden's office. He plays the song over the prison's public address system while locking the guard tasked with guarding the warden's office in the restroom. The music quickly has the entire jail entranced. Red observes that everyone felt liberated by the sounds of these women, if only for a time. Andy is told to switch off the record player by Norton, who can be seen outside the office fuming over the act of defiance. Andy reacts by increasing the volume. Hadley is instructed to break into the office by the warden, and Andy is promptly placed in solitary confinement for 2 weeks. When he emerges, he boasts to his companions that the stretch was the easiest time he had spent in the hole since he accomplished it while listening to Mozart's Figaro for solace. He talks on the strength of hope in jail and how it may sustain them when the other inmates tell them how unlikely it is. Red vehemently disagrees with Andy and advises him to get used to life without hope, saying it is risky in a place like SHAWSHANK. Red gets up from the table furious when Andy suggests that Brooks actually done what he said he would. Soon after, Red learns he has been imprisoned for 30 years at a fresh parole hearing. He speaks just like he did 5 years prior, but without any excitement. Once more, his parole is denied. Red responds by presenting Andy a massive Marilyn Monroe poster to honor his 10 years after Andy presents him with a harp to mark his 30 years. A little over 4 years after the Mozart incident, the state Senate finally decides they can't just fire Andy with another check. So they give him $500 a year to spend on building his library. Andy makes good use of it, strikes arrangements with reading groups and charitable organizations, and establishes the greatest jail library in the state, naming it after Brooks. Andy starts mentoring prisoners who want to finish high school so they can obtain a good career when they get out with the help of the expanded library and other resources. While this is going on, Warden Norton takes use of Andy's information and comes up with a plan to hire prisoners to work on government projects that he wins by outbidding other contractors. Prisoners are cheap labor. On occasion, if the bribe is good enough, he lets other contractors win jobs. Using the fictitious identity of Randall Stephens, a guy who only exists on paper, whom Andy himself established via his understanding of the system and mail-order forms, Andy launders the money by opening many accounts in multiple institutions and making multiple investments. The formal documents for Randall Stephens include his birth certificate, social security number, and driver's license. If anyone were to look into the scheme, they would be chasing a man who only existed on paper. Red is told the facts by Andy, who adds that he had to go to prison to learn how to be a criminal in order to do so. To do time for breaking and entering, a young prisoner called Tommy Gil Billows comes to Shawshank in 1965. Andy and Red make friends with Tommy because he is affable, gregarious, and well-liked by the other prisoners. Andy advises Tommy to think about another line of business besides thievery because he seems to be not very good at it after Tommy confesses that he has been in and out of prison since he was 13 years old. The idea truly resonates with Tommy, who seeks Andy for assistance in working for a high school equivalency credential. Tommy is a good student, but even so, he becomes upset during the exam and crumples it up before throwing it away. Even so, Andy gets it and sends it. Tommy inquires about Andy's situation, which Red answers. When Tommy hears the tale, he appears distressed. He then shares with Andy and Red the tale of a former cellmate from a different jail who boasted of murdering a professional golfer at the country club he worked at together with his lover. The woman's banker husband had served time in jail for those killings. With this fresh knowledge, Andy meets with the warden full of optimism and expects Norton to assist him in obtaining a new trial with Tommy as a witness. Norton's response is exactly the opposite of what Andy had hoped for. The warden gets irate and sends Andy to isolation for a month when he vehemently states that he will never divulge the money laundering methods he set up for Norton over the years. The prisoners talk about the punishment, noting that it is the longest period of time spent in isolation that they have ever heard of. The fact that Andy has served over 20 years in jail for a crime he didn't commit and may perhaps be innocent dawns on them as well. Tommy receives word from the school board that he passed the test and has earned a high school diploma. In his alone cell, Andy receives the news from a guard, who makes him grin a bit. Later, Tommy is taken outside in the dark to speak with the warden in private. He is questioned by Warden Norton about the veracity of the tale he told Andy and about his willingness to testify on Andy's behalf. Tommy wholeheartedly concurs. Before directing Hadley to shoot the man dead, the warden grinned at him. When the warden pays Andy a visit in seclusion, he informs him that Tommy attempted to flee and that Hadley was forced to shoot him. Andy rejects that explanation and informs Norton that everything ends and that he will no longer be working for him. If Andy refuses to work for him, the warden threatens to close the library, burn all the books, and transfer him to a very different cell in a very different area of the jail with the most seasoned offenders. He then departs and gives Andy another month in seclusion to reflect. When Andy eventually leaves solitary confinement, he and Red have a chat in which Andy discusses how much he loved his wife and how he still feels guilty for her death even though he did not shoot her. Then, if he were to ever be released from prison, he would discuss his initiatives. He talks of his desire to spend the rest of his life in Zihuatanejo, a seaside town on Mexico's Pacific coast, where he would also like to run a hotel. He then asks Red if he'd want to join him, but Red replies that he thinks Brooks is too far gone and declines. Then, he blames Andy for allowing Hope to affect his thinking in such a way, saying that doing so will only lead to his demise. Red is asked whether he is familiar with the Buxton, Maine region as Andy accepts and prepares to depart. Then he describes to Red a very particular hay field with a big oak tree at the end of a stone wall. Then, he requests Red's assurance that, should he ever be released from prison, he will go for that oak tree and find something that was buried amid the stones, but he won't specify what it is. Red makes a commitment, but he worries about how his pal is feeling. When he finds out that Andy has asked Haywood for a 6-foot rope, his concerns are only increased. Red thinks Andy may be on the verge of committing himself because he has finally reached his breaking point. Before turning in for the evening, Norton requests that Andy polish his shoes and dry clean his suit. As the guards turn down the lights for the evening, Andy goes back to his cell. It was the loneliest night of Red's life, he says. The next morning, Andy is not in front of his cell as he usually is and has not returned the morning call. As he approaches Andy's cell, the guard screams at him for being late and expects to find a critically ill or dead Andy there. Norton is shocked when he discovers Andy's sneakers in his shoebox rather than his own. The alarm then sounds, alerting staff to a missing prisoner. Andy's cell is vacant as Norton comes in and demands an explanation. Red is brought in by Hadley, but Red maintains he is unaware of Andy's plans. Norton begins tossing Andy's carved pebbles around the cell as he grows more aggressive and paranoid. He throws one at Andy's Raquel Welch poster, which had previously featured Rita Hayworth and Marilyn Monroe, and it smashes through and into the wall. A tunnel that is barely broad enough for a man to crawl into is shown as Norton pulls the poster from the wall. Red narrates a series of flashback scenes that indicate Andy trying to innocently carve his name on his cell wall when a piece of it fell off many years prior, not long after obtaining his rock hammer. Geology enthusiast Andy noticed that the material used to construct the wall may allow him to create an escape tunnel if necessary. To cover the hole, Andy initially had a huge Rita Hayworth poster made. He then spent years using his rock hammer to dig at night while concealing the soil from his work in his pockets, which he would subsequently empty during his morning stroll in the courtyard. When Tommy died, Andy made the decision that it was time to leave. Andy wore Norton's clothing underneath his own to his cell during the storms the night before, and he was fortunate that no one, even Red, saw Norton's sparkling black shoes on his feet. He put a lot of his stuff, some papers, and Norton's clothes in a plastic bag that he secured to himself with the rope he had requested, then he crawled out of his hole with everything in the bag. The tunnel he had dug took him to a spot between the prison's two walls, where he discovered a sewage main line. He smashed the sewage line with a rock multiple times in sync with the lightning bolts, ultimately breaking it open. Andy emerged in a creek beyond the fortifications after crawling through 500 yards of the pipe's untreated sewage. Later, A search team discovered his jail uniform, a bar of soap, and a much rusted rock hammer. Andy enters the Maine National Bank in Portland, where he had deposited Norton's money, as the warden and Red are learning of his brilliant escape from capture. He closes the account and leaves with a cashier's check while posing as Randall Stephens and carrying all the required paperwork. He asks them to ship a parcel for him before he departs. He continues to visit almost a dozen other neighborhood banks, leaving with around $370,000. Along with Andy's written admissions and testimony, the box also contains Warden Norton's financial records, which are sent directly to the Portland Daily Bugle newspaper. Soon later, in order to cover the unfolding story, many reporters and the Maine State Police raid SHAWSHANK prison. Hadley is detained by the state police after being accused of killing Tommy. Red claims that as he was being hauled away, Hadley supposedly began sobbing like a young girl in the back seat of the police squad car. Red claims that he heard these untrue allegations through the grapevine. Warden Norton finally opens the safe in his office that he hadn't touched since Andy escaped and discovers the Bible he had given Andy along with a note to the warden stating that he was correct. Salvation did lay within, as Hadley is taken away in a police squad car, and the local district attorney enters the prison with several policemen holding a warrant for Norton's arrest. When Norton opens the book of Exodus, he discovers that all of the pages have been shaped like Andy's rock hammer. As the police knock on Norton's door, he returns to his desk, pulls out a little pistol, and shoots himself once in the head to end his life. Red said he questioned whether the warden considered how Andy might ever have gotten the best of him before firing the gun. Shortly later, Red receives an unwritten postcard from Fort Hancock, Texas. Red interprets it as proof that Andy managed to enter Mexico and find freedom. Red and his friends pass the time by discussing Andy's escapades, with a few embellishments, but Red develops a sadness because he misses his comrade. Red tells the parole board at his subsequent parole hearing in 1967 that the term rehabilitated was just made up to support their position. Then he goes on to say how much he regrets his earlier deeds, not because he's in jail but rather because he realizes how bad they were. Finally, he asks the board to stop wasting his time and leave him alone, adding that he will have to live with that decision for the rest of his life. Finally, he is given parole. He moves into the same homes and workplaces that Brooks did, even observing the message Brooks had inscribed on the wooden beam. He often passes a pawn shop with multiple firearms displayed in the window. The vow he made to Andy keeps him from considering trying to return to jail when he feels like he has no life outside of the prison where he has spent the most of his adult life. Then he says that he was actually looking at the compasses hidden beneath the firearms, and that's why he purchased one. Red follows Andy's advice, taking a bus to Buxton, where he finds the stone wall he was told about. There is a sizable black stone, as Andy had mentioned. A tiny box with a significant amount of cash and instructions to come find him in Zihuatanejo sits below. However, he doesn't specify the location just in case. Additionally, he claims that for a project of his, he wants someone who can obtain stuff. Red is suddenly aware of the full potential of hope and is ecstatic about the emotions he is experiencing. Red breaches his parole and departs the halfway home after carving a fresh message that says, "Brooks was here, so was Red," into a wooden beam. Red is worried by this because no one is expected to conduct a thorough quest for an old criminal like him. Red commutes by bus to Fort Hancock, from where he enters Mexico. The two friends are finally reunited on a beach of the Pacific coast, just like Andy had been hoping for. Thank you all for listening to this movie explanation. More videos on different movies explanation will come soon in the channel. Stay tuned, stay connected, and stay healthy. Love you all.